In April 1902, a 19-year-old woman sat in her stepfather's house in Butte, Montana, waiting for a telegram that would tell her whether anyone beyond the mining town's gray streets would ever know her name. She had written a book about herself. Not a novel, not a memoir in any conventional sense, but a raw account of her inner life. Her contempt for her surroundings, her desire for recognition, her loneliness. She had mailed the manuscript to Herbert S. Stone and Company in Chicago months earlier. The waiting had become unbearable. When the telegram arrived, it said the book would be published. Mary MacLane read it alone in her room. Within weeks, the story of Mary MacLane became one of the most scandalous publications of the year, outselling every book except the Bible in its first month, discussed in newspapers across the country, condemned from pulpits, banned in cities. She had wanted desperately to be seen. Now she was. But the attention did not transport her. She remained in Butte, in the same house, under the same stepfather's roof. The fame was immediate and hollow. What followed was not escape or fulfillment, but a slow disintegration across 27 more years. A life of brief notoriety, long obscurity, failed attachments, poverty, and isolation that deepened with each passing decade. This is the story of what Mary MacLane believed would save her, and what it destroyed instead. Mary MacLane was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in May 1881, the daughter of James MacLane, a businessman of modest prosperity, and Margaret MacLane, a woman whose ambitions for respectability exceeded her circumstances. The family lived comfortably enough in a city that was still forming itself, still deciding what it would become. Mary was the youngest of 3 children, and in the early years there was no indication that her childhood would be unusual or particularly troubled. Her father died when she was 4 years old. The cause was likely typhoid or pneumonia. Records from that time and place are incomplete, but the effect was immediate and total. James MacLane's death removed not only income, but stability. Margaret was left with 3 children and limited means. She did what many women in her position did. She sought another husband. Within a year, Margaret married Henry G. Clens, a man who worked in mining interests and had connections in the American West. Clens was not unkind, but he was not James MacLane. He was a stepfather, and Mary understood the difference. The marriage brought practicality, not warmth. It also brought displacement. In 1887, when Mary was 6, Clens moved the family from Winnipeg to Butte, Montana. The decision was economic. Butte was experiencing a copper boom, and men with mining connections could find opportunity there. For Margaret, the move represented a chance to rebuild. For Mary, it represented severance. Butte was not Winnipeg. It was a frontier mining town carved into the side of a hill, surrounded by treeless mountains and dominated by headframes and smelter smoke. The streets were mud or dust depending on the season. The population was transient, rough, largely male. The air smelled of sulfur. The town existed for extraction, not settlement, and it showed in every building and street corner. The MacLane-Clens household settled into a house on West Granite Street, a respectable address by Butte standards, but respectability in Butte was a relative measure. The family occupied a position that was neither wealthy nor poor, neither frontier nor refined. They existed in a social middle ground that satisfied no one, least of all Margaret, who had not moved west to remain in ambiguity. Mary attended public school. She was an intelligent child, quick with language, but she did not fit easily among the other children. Butte was a place where survival and practicality were valued, where education was a means to work, not an end in itself. Mary's tendencies toward reading, toward solitude, toward observation rather than participation, marked her as strange. She had no close friends. At home, the household functioned with a kind of strained civility. Clens provided for the family, worked steadily, maintained order. Margaret managed the household and enforced social aspirations that felt increasingly futile in a town that had little use for them. Mary's older siblings adapted more easily. They found roles, found acceptance. Mary did not. She spent much of her time alone in her room, reading whatever books she could find. The selection was limited. Butte had no significant library, no literary culture. She read the Bible, Shakespeare, whatever volumes the house contained, or that she could borrow. She developed a habit of retreating inward, of observing the world through a pane of glass rather than participating in it. By the time she was 10, the pattern was established. She was isolated not by circumstance alone, but by temperament. She did not like the people around her. She did not like Butte. She did not like the life her mother had chosen or the stepfather who provided it. She felt superior to her surroundings and trapped within them simultaneously. Margaret noticed but did not understand. She saw a daughter who refused to be pleasant, who would not make efforts towards sociability, who seemed determined to make herself unlovable. Margaret had worked to create stability after her first husband's death, had remarried, had moved west, had built a respectable household under difficult conditions. She expected gratitude, or at least compliance. Mary offered neither. The household tensions were not dramatic. There were no violent confrontations, no spectacular cruelties. The dysfunction was quieter than that. It was a steady accumulation of small resentments, unspoken disappointments, and emotional distance that widened year by year. Mary felt unloved. Margaret felt unappreciated. Cleanser remained largely absent from the emotional dynamics, focused on work and practicality. Mary began to develop a private mythology about herself. She was different. She was special. She was meant for something beyond Butte, beyond this house, beyond these people who could not understand her. The mythology was both self-protection and self-deception. It allowed her to endure the isolation by reframing it as evidence of her uniqueness, rather than her failure to connect. She had no evidence that she was special. She had written nothing yet. She had accomplished nothing. She was simply a girl in a mining town who did not fit in, and who had constructed an elaborate internal narrative to explain why that was everyone else's fault, rather than her own. The years between 10 and 15 passed slowly. She attended school without distinction. She had no romantic attachments, no close friendships, no activities that brought her into community. She read. She walked alone in the hills around Butte, finding the landscape as bleak as the town itself. She went home and retreated to her room. By 16, the isolation had calcified into something harder. It was no longer a temporary condition she might grow out of. It was her identity. She was the girl who did not belong, who did not want to belong, who despised the world she had been forced into, and who believed that somewhere else, in some other place, she would finally be recognized for what she truly was. She had no plan to get there. She had no skills beyond language and observation. She had no connections beyond her stepfather's house. She had only the certainty that she deserved more than this, and the growing fear that she would never escape. The house on West Granite Street was never Mary's home. It was Henry Cleanse's house, built on his income, organized according to his preferences, and Margaret's social aspirations. Mary lived there as a dependent, a fact that shaped every interaction within its walls. Cleanse was not a harsh man, but he was not a warm one either. He had married a widow with 3 children and accepted the responsibility that came with that decision. He provided adequately. The family never went hungry. They were clothed, housed, respectable by Butte standards. But Cleanse's relationship with his stepchildren remained transactional. He fulfilled obligations without affection. Mary understood this arrangement clearly. She was supported, not loved. The distinction mattered to her more than it seemed to matter to her siblings, who adapted to the household dynamics with less resistance. Her older brother found work in mining offices. Her sister moved toward the social expectations appropriate for young women in frontier towns: church attendance, domestic skills, eventual marriage. They fit themselves into the available roles. Mary refused. She would not pretend gratitude she did not feel. She would not perform the kind of pleasant, accommodating femininity that might have eased tensions in the household. She was sullen at dinner, absent from family gatherings when possible, visibly contemptuous of the social rituals Margaret tried to maintain. Margaret responded with a combination of frustration and bewilderment. She had survived widowhood, rebuilt her life, created a stable household under difficult circumstances. She expected her children to recognize the effort this required. Instead, her youngest daughter treated every meal, every conversation, every attempt at normalcy as an imposition. The conflicts were not loud. Butte society valued restraint in domestic matters, but the household was thick with unspoken resentment. Margaret would ask Mary to help with household tasks. Mary would comply with visible reluctance, performing the work in a way that communicated disdain rather than cooperation. Margaret would criticize Mary's attitude. Mary would retreat to her room and write in journals that no one else saw. The journals became Mary's primary relationship. She wrote constantly, filling pages with observations about the people around her, the ugliness of Butte, the stupidity of social conventions, the certainty of her own superiority. The writing was not skilled yet, but it was compulsive. She was documenting her internal life with the intensity of someone who believed it would matter someday. Church was another site of conflict. Margaret insisted on regular attendance at the Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the more established congregations in Butte. Sunday services were social performances as much as religious observances. Families demonstrated respectability through presence and proper behavior. Mary attended but did not participate. She sat through sermons without singing hymns. She observed the other congregants with barely concealed contempt. She found the minister's language empty, the congregation's piety false, the entire exercise a performance of values no one actually held. She was not wrong about the performance aspect, but her refusal to perform, along with everyone else, isolated her further. By 17, Mary had developed a reputation in the household and in the limited social circles the family moved through. She was difficult. She was strange. She was too smart for her own good, too proud, too unwilling to accept her circumstances. Mothers warned their daughters away from her. Young men showed no interest. She was not invited to social gatherings, and when she was included by obligation, her presence dampened the atmosphere. Margaret began to worry about Mary's future in concrete terms. An unmarried daughter was a financial and social burden. Mary showed no interest in marriage, no skills that might lead to respectable employment, no willingness to make herself agreeable to potential suitors. She was intelligent, but intelligence in women was useful only if paired with social graces and a willingness to subordinate it to male authority. Mary possessed neither. The worry produced more pressure. Margaret pushed harder for Mary to socialize, to attend church functions, to develop the kind of pleasant demeanor that might attract a suitable husband. Mary pushed back harder. The household became a site of constant low-level warfare, fought through silences and small refusals rather than open conflict. Cleanse largely withdrew from these dynamics. He worked long hours, came home tired, expected quiet and order. He had no patience for Mary's moods or Margaret's anxieties. He provided financial support and expected the household to function smoothly around his presence. When it did not, he retreated further into work and silence. Mary noticed his withdrawal and interpreted it as vindication. She was right to refuse this life. Even Cleanza, who had chosen it, could barely tolerate it. The household was a performance everyone was exhausted by, and she was the only one honest enough to stop pretending. But the honesty isolated her completely. By 18, she had no friends, no suitors, no prospects, no path forward. She was trapped in a house she despised, in a town she hated, with a family that found her presence difficult and burdensome. She read voraciously, walked alone in the barren hills, and wrote in journals that accumulated in her room like evidence of a life happening only on paper. The town itself offered nothing. Butte's social life revolved around mining company hierarchies, ethnic enclaves, saloons, and churches. There was no literary culture, no intellectual community, no place for a young woman who wanted recognition for her mind rather than her marriageability. The few women who worked outside the home were teachers, seamstresses, boarding house operators. Mary had no training for any of these roles and no interest in acquiring it. She began to fantasize about escape, but the fantasies were vague. She would go to Chicago, to New York, to some city where her intelligence would be recognized and valued. She would become a writer, though she had written nothing publishable. She would be famous, though she had no idea how fame was achieved. The fantasies sustained her, but had no connection to any practical plan. By 19, the situation had calcified. She was an adult woman living in her stepfather's house with no independence, no income, no path toward either. She was educated enough to feel superior to her surroundings, but not educated enough to escape them. She was isolated by choice and circumstance in equal measure. The life she wanted existed only in her imagination, and the life she had was unbearable. In January 1901, Mary MacLane began keeping a diary with a new kind of intensity. She had written journals before, scattered observations and complaints, but this was different. This was systematic. She wrote every day, sometimes multiple times a day, filling page after page with detailed accounts of her thoughts, her desires, her contempt for everything around her. She was 19 years old and had accomplished nothing. She had no occupation, no prospects, no relationships that brought her satisfaction. She still lived in her stepfather's house on West Granite Street. Nothing had changed since childhood except her age and her awareness of how completely trapped she was. The diary became a project. She wrote in it the way someone might write a book, conscious of structure, of voice, of an eventual reader. She was not writing only for herself. She was writing for an audience she believed would someday understand her, value her, recognize what Butte could not. The entries were strange and consuming. She wrote about the devil, whom she claimed to love more than God. She wrote about Napoleon, whom she admired with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She wrote about a teacher named Fanny Corbin, describing her feelings in language that was unmistakably romantic, though she never called it that directly. She wrote about her hatred of Butte, her family, her life. The tone was grandiose and self-pitying in equal measure. She described herself as a genius trapped among idiots, a sensitive soul crushed by frontier brutality, a woman of extraordinary depth forced to endure shallow people and their shallow concerns. She was convinced of her own exceptionalism with no evidence beyond her own conviction. But the writing itself was compelling in its rawness. She had no literary training, no sense of what was appropriate to confess or conceal. She wrote about her body, her desires, her contempt, her loneliness with a frankness that would have horrified anyone in Butte who read it. She wrote as if no one was watching, while simultaneously performing for an imagined audience that would someday vindicate her. She wrote about masturbation, about her attraction to women, about her disgust with conventional morality. She wrote about wanting to be famous, to be recognized, to escape Butte and never return. She wrote about her stepfather's dullness, her mother's superficiality, her siblings' mediocrity. She spared no one, least of all herself. The diary consumed her time. She wrote for hours each day, neglecting household duties, ignoring her mother's complaints, retreating deeper into the only relationship that felt real to her, the relationship between herself and the page. Margaret noticed the obsessive writing but did not understand it. She saw Mary spending entire days in her room, emerging only for meals, speaking to no one, producing nothing useful. The writing seemed like another form of Mary's refusal to engage with actual life, another way of avoiding the responsibilities of adulthood. Cleanse barely noticed. He had long since given up trying to understand his stepdaughter. He provided for her out of obligation, but he did not concern himself with her interior life or her daily activities. As long as she caused no public scandal, she was not his problem. Mary wrote through the winter and into spring. The diary grew longer, more elaborate, more convinced of its own importance. She began to shape the entries into something resembling a narrative, organizing them by theme rather than strict chronology. She was no longer simply recording her life. She was constructing a version of herself that she believed deserved attention. By summer, she had decided the diary was publishable. She had no experience with publishing, no connections to the literary world, no understanding of how books were made or sold, but she believed the writing was extraordinary enough to overcome these obstacles. She believed her genius was self-evident. She began copying the diary entries into a cleaner manuscript. The process took months. She worked in her room at the kitchen table when the house was empty, anywhere she could find privacy. She edited as she copied, sharpening language, removing redundancies, but keeping the confessional rawness that made the writing distinctive. The household continued around her without much awareness of what she was doing. Margaret assumed Mary was writing letters or keeping a journal, activities that seemed harmless if pointless. Cleanse paid no attention. Mary's siblings had their own lives and little interest in hers. By autumn, she had a completed manuscript. She titled it The Story of Mary MacLane, by herself. The title was egotistical and accurate. The book was nothing but Mary, her thoughts, her desires, her complaints, her self-regard. There was no plot, no external events, just the relentless presence of Mary's consciousness, examining itself and finding everything else inadequate. She had no idea where to send it. She went to Butte's small public library and looked through publishers' addresses in the few literary magazines available. She chose Herbert S. Stone and Company in Chicago because they had published work by new writers and because Chicago seemed more attainable than New York. She wrapped the manuscript carefully, addressed it in her best handwriting, and took it to the post office herself. She mailed it in November 1901 without telling anyone in her household. She returned home and waited. The waiting was excruciating. Weeks passed with no response. She checked the mail obsessively. She imagined rejection, acceptance, indifference. She had staked everything on this manuscript, though she had no backup plan if it failed. December came. Still nothing. Christmas passed in the usual strained household observances. Mary participated minimally, her mind elsewhere. She had sent herself out into the world in the form of words on paper, and now she could only wait to see if anyone would receive her. January 1902 arrived. She turned 20. The household marked the occasion with a small dinner that Mary endured rather than enjoyed. She felt older than 20, exhausted by the effort of enduring Butte, of living in her stepfather's house, of waiting for a life that might never arrive. In February, she received a letter from Herbert S. Stone. They were interested. They wanted to publish the manuscript. They had concerns about some of the content, but believed the book would find readers. They offered a contract. Mary read the letter alone in her room. She had been right. She was exceptional. Someone beyond Butte had recognized it. The vindication was immediate and overwhelming. She signed the contract and mailed it back the same day. The contract from Herbert S. Stone and Company arrived with conditions. The publisher wanted revisions. Certain passages were too explicit, too scandalous, even for a firm willing to publish unconventional work. They asked Mary to soften some language, remove specific references, make the book acceptable enough for distribution without destroying what made it distinctive. Mary agreed to the revisions, but reluctantly. She understood that publication required compromise, but each change felt like a betrayal of the honesty that made the manuscript worth reading. She reworked passages, replaced direct statements with implications, removed names while keeping the emotional content intact. The process took weeks and frustrated her deeply. She worked alone in her room, as always. She still had not told her family about the book. Margaret knew Mary had been writing something, but she assumed it was personal correspondence or a journal, nothing serious. Cleanse remained unaware and uninterested. Mary preferred their ignorance. She wanted the book to arrive as a fact, not a possibility they could discourage or dismiss. The publisher sent proofs in March. Mary read through them carefully, checking for errors, experiencing the strange displacement of seeing her private thoughts transformed into typeset pages. The book looked real now, permanent. It would exist outside her room, outside Butte, outside her control. She sent the corrected proofs back to Chicago and resumed waiting. The publication date was set for April. Herbert S. Stone planned a modest initial printing, uncertain how the book would be received. They were taking a risk on an unknown writer from Montana who had written something that fit no established category. Mary waited through late March with increasing anxiety. She had believed publication would solve everything, would prove her worth, provide income, offer escape from Butte. But now that it was imminent, she felt exposed. The book was intensely personal, confessional in ways that violated every convention of female propriety. She had written it assuming an audience that would understand and admire her honesty. She had not fully considered an audience that might judge or mock her instead. In early April, advance copies arrived at the house on West Granite Street. Mary retrieved the package from the post office herself. She carried it home, went directly to her room, and opened it alone. Inside were 6 copies of The Story of Mary MacLane by herself, bound in red cloth, her name on the cover. She held the book and felt nothing like triumph. She felt strange, suspended between achievement and dread. The book existed. It would be distributed to bookstores across the country. People would read her private thoughts, her confessions, her contempt. There was no way to take it back now. She kept the books hidden in her room. She still said nothing to her family. She wanted to wait until the book proved itself, until she could present publication as a success rather than a peculiarity. The story of Mary MacLane was released to bookstores on April 23, 1902. The first reviews appeared within days. They were not kind. Critics called the book egotistical, blasphemous, immoral. They described Mary as a disturbed young woman seeking attention through shameless self-exposure. Some reviews refused to quote from the book at all, claiming the content was too offensive for family newspapers. But the negative reviews created curiosity. Readers wanted to see what was so scandalous. Bookstores sold out their initial stock within a week. Herbert S. Stone rushed additional printings. By early May, the book was selling faster than anything the publisher had released in years. Mary learned about the sales figures from letters sent by the publishing house. She read about her own notoriety in newspapers that arrived in Butte days after publication in Chicago or New York. She was famous, suddenly and completely, but the fame arrived at a distance, filtered through print, disconnected from her daily life. She still went to dinner in her stepfather's house. She still walked the same streets in Butte. Nothing in her immediate circumstances had changed. But somewhere beyond Montana, thousands of people were reading her private thoughts and forming opinions about her character. The contradiction was disorienting. She had wanted recognition, but she had imagined it would transform her life immediately. Instead, she remained in place while the book traveled without her. She was famous and still trapped simultaneously. Margaret learned about the book from neighbors. Someone in Butte had ordered a copy from a Chicago bookstore. The news spread quickly through the town's small social networks. Margaret confronted Mary at dinner, demanding to know if the rumors were true. Mary confirmed them. She had written a book. It had been published. It was selling well in cities across the country. Margaret was horrified. She had not read the book yet, but she had heard enough from neighbors to understand it contained personal confessions, criticisms of religion, inappropriate content. The book reflected on the family, on the household, on their respectability in Butte. Cleanse's response was quieter but equally disturbed. He had provided for Mary, given her shelter and support, and she had repaid him by publishing a book that described her contempt for her life in his house. He did not forbid her from anything. She was 20 years old. The book was already published. But his silence conveyed disapproval more effectively than anger would have. The household became colder. Margaret stopped speaking to Mary except when necessary. Cleanse avoided her entirely. Her siblings were embarrassed by the attention, by the association with someone who had become locally notorious. Mary retreated further into her room. She had achieved what she wanted: publication, recognition, proof that she was not ordinary. But the achievement had not freed her. She was still in Butte, still dependent on her stepfather's support, still isolated. The fame existed elsewhere, in cities she had never visited, among readers she would never meet. Letters began arriving. Some were admiring, from young women who felt the same isolation and found Mary's honesty liberating. Others were hostile, calling her immoral, accusing her of seeking attention through shamelessness. Some were proposals of marriage from men who assumed a woman who wrote so frankly about desire must be available. Mary read all the letters but answered few. She did not know how to respond to strangers who believed they knew her. Because they had read her book, the attention was overwhelming and unsatisfying. She was seen, but not understood. She was famous, but still alone. By May 1902, the story of Mary MacLane had sold over 100,000 copies. The number was staggering for any book, unprecedented for a first-time author from Montana, writing about nothing but her own interior life. Only the Bible sold more copies that month. The success created a phenomenon that Herbert S. Stone had not anticipated and could not entirely control. Newspapers across the country published excerpts, editorials, moral condemnations. Ministers denounced the book from pulpits. Women's clubs debated whether it should be banned. Young women read it in secret and wrote letters to Mary declaring that she had expressed what they had always felt but never dared say. The book was banned in Boston within 3 weeks of publication. Other cities followed. The bans only increased sales in places where the book remained available. Bookstores displayed it prominently, marketed it as scandalous, sold out repeatedly. Mary became a figure of fascination and outrage simultaneously. Newspapers published her photograph, a stern young woman with dark hair and an unsmiling face, looking directly at the camera with no attempt at charm or approachability. The image reinforced the book's tone. She looked exactly like someone who would write such a book. Journalists requested interviews. Mary refused most of them. She had no interest in performing for reporters who wanted her to be either repentant or defiant. She had said what she wanted to say in the book. She had nothing to add for newspaper readers seeking entertainment. The few interviews she did grant were awkward. Reporters came to Butte expecting to find someone dramatic, someone who matched the intensity of the book's prose. Instead, they found a quiet young woman who spoke carefully, who seemed uncomfortable with attention, who gave short answers and avoided elaboration. The interviews disappointed readers who wanted spectacle. Mary came across as sullen rather than fascinating, withdrawn rather than bold. The contrast between the book's passionate confessions and Mary's guarded public presence confused people. They had expected the writer and the woman to be the same, and they were not. In Butte, the reaction was uniformly negative. The town that Mary had described with such contempt responded with equal contempt for her. She had made Butte famous for all the wrong reasons. She had portrayed it as barren, ugly, spiritually dead. She had described its people as shallow and conventional. Butte residents who had never cared about Mary MacLane before now cared very much about what she had written about them. Church congregations discussed the book as evidence of moral decay. The Methodist minister who had presided over services Mary attended delivered sermons about pride, blasphemy, and the dangers of excessive education in young women. He did not name Mary directly, but everyone understood. Women who had known Margaret socially distanced themselves. The association with Mary's scandal made the entire family suspect. Margaret stopped attending church functions. She could not endure the pitying looks, the barely concealed judgment, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Cleanse's business relationships became strained. Men he worked with made jokes about his notorious stepdaughter, about households that could not control their women, about the consequences of allowing girls too much freedom. He responded with silence, but the comments stung. He had provided for Mary, and she had repaid him with public humiliation. Mary noticed the isolation closing in, but felt vindicated rather than ashamed. Butte's rejection proved everything she had written about the town. They could not understand her. They responded to honesty with condemnation. She had been right to hate them, but the vindication did not translate into escape. She remained in the house on West Granite Street because she had nowhere else to go. The book was selling, but royalty payments came quarterly and would not arrive for months. She had no immediate income, no means of supporting herself independently. Herbert S. Stone sent telegrams congratulating her on the book's success, discussing second and third printings, proposing publicity opportunities. Mary responded minimally. She had wanted recognition, but the machinery of fame felt alien and exhausting. Publishers, reporters, readers, they all wanted something from her, wanted her to be someone, and she had no energy for performance. Letters arrived daily. Most came from young women, many of them describing similar isolation, similar contempt for their circumstances, similar desires for recognition and escape. They wrote as if Mary had given voice to experiences they thought were uniquely theirs. They thanked her for her honesty. They asked for advice. Mary read the letters with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She had connected with readers, proven that her experience was not singular, but the connections were paper-thin, mediated through writing, offering no actual relationship. The women who wrote to her were strangers. They knew the Mary of the book, not the Mary sitting in a room in Butte with nowhere to go. Some letters came from men proposing marriage, others from men making cruder propositions. They had read her descriptions of desire and assumed she was available, willing, seeking male attention. Mary found these letters repulsive but unsurprising. She had known that writing frankly about her body would invite misunderstanding, but she had underestimated how pervasive the misunderstanding would be. A few letters came from established writers. Hamlin Garland wrote expressing interest in her work. Harriet Monroe, a Chicago poet, sent encouragement. These letters mattered more to Mary than the others. They suggested she might have a literary future beyond this single scandalous book. But the encouragement was vague. The writers praised her honesty without offering concrete opportunities. They acknowledged her talent without extending invitations into literary circles. Mary remained outside, looking in, famous, but not welcomed. By June, the initial frenzy had peaked. Sales remained strong, but were no longer unprecedented. Newspapers moved on to other scandals. The book settled into sustained success, rather than explosive phenomenon. Mary's notoriety stabilized at a level that was substantial but no longer overwhelming. She remained in Butte. The fame had not transported her. The money had not yet arrived. The household had not forgiven her. She had wanted the book to solve everything, and it had solved nothing except proving that she was capable of being noticed. The isolation that had driven her to write the book now deepened in response to its publication. Butte rejected her more completely than before. Her family withdrew further, and Mary sat in her room, famous and alone, waiting for the success to mean something beyond itself. The first royalty check arrived in July 1902. Mary opened the envelope alone in her room and stared at the amount. It was substantial, more money than she had ever possessed, more than most women in Butte earned in a year. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt insufficient. The money was significant but not transformative. It could support her for months, perhaps a year, if she lived modestly. But it could not guarantee independence permanently. She had no skills beyond writing, no assurance that another book would succeed, no plan for how to convert temporary income into lasting security. She deposited the check at the Butte Bank without telling anyone in the household. She kept the money separate, private, a resource she might need if the household became completely intolerable. But she did not leave. She had nowhere specific to go, no contacts in other cities, no understanding of how to establish herself beyond Butte. The household continued its cold functionality. Margaret spoke to Mary only about necessary matters, meals, household tasks, basic logistics. There was no warmth, no forgiveness, no acknowledgement of Mary's success except as a source of family shame. Cleanse maintained his distance. He provided for Mary because she still lived under his roof, but the provision felt increasingly conditional. He had fulfilled his obligation to his stepchildren, but Mary's book had violated an unspoken contract. She was supposed to be grateful, or at least quiet. She had been neither. Mary's siblings visited less frequently. Her brother had moved into his own lodgings. Her sister, now married, came to the house only for obligatory family gatherings. Both avoided being seen with Mary in public. The association with scandal compromised their own social standing. The town's hostility remained active through the summer. Newspapers in Butte published editorials condemning the book and questioning the morality of its author. Local clergy continued to reference it as evidence of modern corruption. Women who encountered Mary on the street looked away or crossed to avoid her. The rejection was not limited to strangers. Former teachers, neighbors, people who had known Mary since childhood all treated her as contaminated. She had violated something essential by exposing her interior life, by writing frankly about desire and contempt, by refusing to present herself as modest or repentant. Mary walked through Butte and felt the weight of constant judgment. The fame that existed in distant cities meant nothing here. In Butte, she was not a successful author. She was a scandal, a cautionary tale, a young woman who had brought shame on herself and her family. The isolation intensified her contempt. She had been right about Butte all along. The town was narrow, provincial, incapable of recognizing anything beyond its own small conventions. But the contempt no longer felt satisfying. It felt exhausting. In August, a theater company approached Mary about adapting her book for the stage. They wanted to create a dramatic version, with an actress playing Mary performing selected passages. The proposal came with an offer of payment and the promise of additional publicity. Mary refused. The idea of watching an actress perform her private thoughts felt grotesque. The book had already exposed her more than she had anticipated. A theatrical production would compound the exposure, turn her confessions into entertainment for audiences who would laugh or gasp or judge without understanding. Herbert S. Stone was disappointed by her refusal. He saw the theatrical adaptation as an opportunity to sustain interest in the book, to reach audiences who might not read but would attend a performance. He wrote to Mary explaining the financial benefits, the career opportunities. Mary remained firm. Some things could not be sold, even when money was involved. By fall, sales of the book had slowed. It remained in print and continued selling steadily, but the initial phenomenon had passed. Publishers who had hoped Mary would write a follow-up began sending inquiries. They wanted another book, ideally something equally scandalous, equally confessional. Mary tried to write. She sat at her desk with blank pages and attempted to recreate the intensity that had produced the first book. But the circumstances had changed. She had written the diary out of genuine desperation, genuine isolation, genuine need to be seen. Now she was attempting to perform the same honesty on demand for an audience that expected scandal rather than truth. The writing came slowly and felt false. She could describe her continued isolation in Butte, but the isolation itself had changed. She was no longer unknown and desperate. She was famous and miserable, which was different. The misery felt less pure, complicated by the fact that she had achieved what she wanted and found it empty. She abandoned several attempts at new work. The publisher grew impatient. They had invested in Mary MacLane as a literary property and expected her to produce. But Mary had written one book because she had to, because she had no other way to survive psychologically. She could not manufacture that urgency artificially. Winter arrived. Mary turned 21. The milestone meant legal adulthood, full independence, the end of any obligation her stepfather might feel toward her. The household observed her birthday minimally. There was cake, a few forced pleasantries. No one acknowledged the significance of the age or discussed what it might mean for Mary's future. Mary thought about leaving Butte. She had money now. She could go to Chicago, to New York, to any city where her name might still carry recognition. But the thought of arriving in a strange city alone, with no contacts, no support system, no clear purpose beyond escape, paralyzed her. The fame had not prepared her for practical independence. She knew how to write about isolation. She did not know how to navigate the world beyond her stepfather's house. The book had made her visible, but not capable. She remained in Butte through the winter of 1902 and into 1903, famous and stationary, recognized across the country, and friendless in her own town, successful and more isolated than she had been before anyone knew her name. Mary left Butte in March 1903. She packed a single trunk with clothes, books, and manuscripts. She said minimal goodbyes to her family. Margaret was relieved to see her go. Cleanse said nothing. Mary boarded a train heading east and did not look back. She chose Chicago because Herbert S. Stone was there, because the city had a literary culture, because it was far from Montana but not as intimidating as New York. She arrived with enough money to support herself for several months, and no plan beyond that. She took a room in a boarding house on the south side. The room was small, cheaply furnished, adequate. She had imagined that leaving Butte would feel like liberation. Instead, it felt like displacement. She was alone in a city of nearly 2 million people, anonymous in a way that was both relief and terror. Chicago did not welcome her. The literary community she had imagined did not materialize into invitations or connections. She was known. Bookstores still carried her book. People recognized her name, but known in a way that created distance rather than intimacy. She was the scandalous girl from Montana, not a serious writer to be cultivated. She attempted to visit Herbert S. Stone's offices. She wanted to discuss future projects, to establish herself as more than a one-book curiosity. The meetings were polite, but unproductive. Stone was interested in another book from her, but only if it matched the confessional intensity of the first. He was not interested in Mary MacLane, the writer. He was interested in Mary MacLane, the phenomenon, and the phenomenon had already peaked. She tried to meet other writers. Chicago had literary salons, reading groups, informal gatherings where writers discussed work and formed alliances. Mary attended a few but found herself unable to navigate the social dynamics. She did not know how to make small talk, how to ingratiate herself, how to be charming or modest or agreeable. The other writers were wary of her. Her reputation preceded her in unhelpful ways. She was egotistical, difficult, too intense. Men found her off-putting. Women found her threatening. She attended gatherings and sat silent, observing, unable to participate in the easy banter that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. She returned to her boarding house room and wrote alone, as she had always written. But the isolation in Chicago felt different from the isolation in Butte. In Butte, she had blamed the town for her loneliness. In Chicago, surrounded by people who shared her interests, she had to confront the possibility that the problem was not her circumstances, but herself. She tried to write a second book. The publisher was waiting for it. Readers presumably wanted it. But the writing would not come. She sat at her desk for hours, producing pages that felt hollow, performative. She was trying to recreate the voice that had made the first book compelling, but that voice had emerged from genuine desperation. Now she was performing desperation for an audience, and the performance showed. By summer, her money was running low. The first book's royalties had been substantial, but not infinite. Sales had declined steadily. She received smaller quarterly payments, barely enough to cover rent and food. She had no other income, no skills that translated into employment. She looked for work and found nothing suitable. She had no training as a teacher, no experience in offices, no domestic skills that might lead to respectable positions. Her education and intelligence were liabilities rather than assets. Employers saw an overeducated woman who would be difficult, dissatisfied, unreliable. She moved to a cheaper boarding house. The room was smaller, darker, in a worse neighborhood. The other residents were transient workers, women of ambiguous respectability, people passing through the city without settling. Mary fit among them in ways she had not fit among writers and intellectuals. The poverty was quiet and grinding. She was not starving, not homeless, but she was constantly aware of money, constantly calculating how long her resources would last. The awareness poisoned everything. She could not write freely when writing had to produce income. She could not explore the city when every expenditure mattered. She became invisible in Chicago. The brief moment when people recognized her name had passed. By 1904, her book was already fading from public consciousness. New scandals, new books, new personalities had replaced her. She was yesterday's curiosity, increasingly irrelevant. She wrote letters to Herbert S. Stone asking about the possibility of reissuing her book with new material, perhaps with commentary or additional diary entries. Stone responded politely, but without enthusiasm. The market had moved on. Reissuing the book would not recreate the original success. Mary tried writing articles for magazines. She submitted pieces to Harper's, The Atlantic, smaller literary journals. Almost all were rejected. The few that were accepted paid little and appeared without notice. She was not building a literary career. She was scrambling to survive. In 1905, she moved again to an even cheaper room in a building that smelled of mildew and cooking grease. Her neighbors were factory workers, laundresses, women whose lives were defined by labor and exhaustion. Mary lived among them but remained separate, too proud to acknowledge commonality, too isolated to form friendships. She stopped attending literary gatherings entirely. She could not afford appropriate clothes, could not maintain the appearance of success. She stayed in her room, wrote sporadically, walked the streets of Chicago alone, watched other people's lives without participating in them. By 1906, she was nearly forgotten. Bookstores no longer prominently displayed her book. Libraries had copies, but they circulated rarely. People who remembered the story of Mary MacLane remembered it as a scandal from several years ago, not as something current or relevant. Mary turned 25 in a rented room in a city that had never accepted her. She had achieved the fame she wanted in Butte. She had escaped Montana. She was living in a city with literary culture and intellectual life. None of it had given her what she needed. The isolation was worse than in Butte because it came with the knowledge that geography had not been the problem. She was alone in Chicago for the same reasons she had been alone in Montana. The circumstances had changed, but she had not. She had no close friends, no romantic attachments, no community. She had her writing, but the writing no longer brought recognition or income. She had wanted to be seen, and she had been seen, and then the world had looked away. She was 25 years old, poor, alone, and already becoming the thing she had feared most: forgotten. In the spring of 1909, Mary met a woman named Helen at a boarding house on the near North Side. Mary had moved again, drawn by slightly lower rent and the hope that a new neighborhood might somehow alter her circumstances. Helen was a stenographer, 23 years old, competent and self-sufficient in ways Mary was not. They encountered each other in the shared parlor where residents could sit in the evenings. Helen was reading a book. Mary noticed the title and made a comment. Helen responded. The conversation continued longer than Mary's conversations usually did. When it ended, Mary felt something she had not felt in years: interest from another person that seemed genuine rather than wary. Helen knew who Mary was. She had read the story of Mary MacLane several years earlier and remembered it vividly. But she did not treat Mary as a scandal or a curiosity. She treated her as someone ordinary, someone who might become a friend. They began spending evenings together in the parlor, talking about books, about Chicago, about nothing in particular. Helen had a straightforward practicality that both attracted and unsettled Mary. She worked, saved money, planned for a future that seemed achievable rather than fantastical. She was not literary or intellectual in ways Mary valued, but she was steady, present, uncomplicated. Mary started writing again, not the forced attempts at a second book, but journal entries similar to those that had produced the first. She wrote about Helen, her gestures, her voice, the way she made Mary feel less isolated simply by being willing to sit in the same room. By summer, Mary understood that what she felt was not friendship. She was attracted to Helen with an intensity that frightened her. She had written about desire in her book, had described attractions to women abstractly. This was different. This was specific, immediate, consuming. Helen seemed unaware of the intensity. She was friendly, warm, treated Mary as a companion, but nothing more. They took walks together on Sundays, attended lectures at settlement houses, sat in parks when the weather allowed. Helen talked about her work, her family in Ohio, her plans to eventually save enough money to open a small business. Mary listened and said little about herself. Mary began giving Helen small gifts, books she could not afford, handkerchiefs with embroidered initials, a brooch she found at a pawn shop. Helen accepted them graciously but without the significance Mary attached to the giving. She thanked Mary and moved on to other topics. By autumn, Mary's feelings had become unbearable. She thought about Helen constantly, waited for their evening conversations, felt physical longing that had no outlet. She knew from her book's reception that expressing such feelings openly would be interpreted as abnormal, sick, evidence of moral corruption. But the feelings existed regardless of how they would be interpreted. In November, Mary wrote Helen a letter. She could not speak what she felt, but she could write it. The letter was carefully worded, but unmistakable. She described her affection, her desire, her hope that Helen might feel something similar. She left the letter in Helen's room and spent the next day in a state of suspended dread. Helen did not appear at dinner. Mary sat in the parlor alone, waiting. Helen did not come down that evening. The next morning, Helen requested a meeting with Mary in the parlor when no one else was present. She came with the letter. She handed it back to Mary, without sitting down. Helen was kind but firm. She valued Mary's friendship but did not share Mary's feelings. She could not share them. She asked Mary to understand that what Mary wanted was impossible. She suggested that perhaps they should spend less time together, at least until Mary's feelings had settled into something more appropriate. Mary took the letter back. She said she understood. She returned to her room and did not come down for 2 days. Helen moved out of the boarding house within a week. She left no forwarding address. The landlady mentioned that Helen had taken a position that included housing. Mary knew this was not true. Helen had left to escape her. The rejection was total and humiliating. Mary had exposed herself and been refused. The refusal was gentle but absolute. Helen had not been cruel. She had simply made clear that what Mary wanted could not exist between them. Mary stopped writing. She stopped leaving her room except when necessary. She paid rent late. The landlady knocked several times with warnings about eviction. Mary barely registered the threats. By December, her money was nearly gone. She had spent recklessly during the summer buying gifts for Helen, trying to create connection through material gestures. Now she had nothing and no prospects of income. She wrote to her mother asking for money. The letter was brief, contained no details about why she needed it. Margaret sent a small amount with a note saying this was the last assistance Mary should expect. The family had obligations, and Mary had chosen to leave, chosen to reject their support. She could not return now and expect help without conditions. Mary used the money for rent and food. It lasted through winter. She looked for work again, found a position addressing envelopes for a mail-order company. The work paid very little, but it was something. She sat at a table with other women, wrote addresses for 8 hours a day, went home exhausted. The work was numbing, repetitive, exactly the kind of meaningless labor she had scorned in her book. Now she performed it because the alternative was starvation. The other women at the table did not know who she was. To them, she was just another woman who needed money, no different from themselves. By spring of 1910, the immediate crisis had passed, but nothing had improved. Mary was working, surviving, existing without purpose beyond basic continuation. She thought about Helen occasionally, but the intensity had faded into dull absence. She had wanted connection, had briefly believed she might have it, and had been refused. The pattern felt inevitable now. She had wanted recognition and received it briefly, then watched it disappear. She had wanted escape from Butte and achieved it, only to find herself equally isolated elsewhere. She had wanted love and offered it to someone who could not accept it. She was 29 years old, working for pennies, living in a rented room, unread and unknown, with nothing ahead of her that looked different from what was behind. In late 1910, Mary began writing again with purpose. Not journal entries or fragmentary attempts, but a sustained project intended for publication. She needed money desperately. The envelope addressing work barely covered rent and food. She had no other marketable skills. Writing was her only possibility of escape from the slow erosion of poverty. She decided to write about her friendship with Helen, though she would not use Helen's real name or identify her directly. She would write about longing, about emotional intensity, about the kind of connection between women that society refused to acknowledge. She would frame it as fiction, though everything in it would be true. The writing came more easily than her previous attempts at a second book. She was not trying to recreate the voice of her first book. She was writing about something immediate, still painful, still unresolved. The pain gave the writing authenticity that her earlier forced attempts had lacked. She titled it, My Friend, Annabel Lee, borrowing from Poe's poem about lost love. The reference was obvious, but she did not care. Subtlety had never been her strength. The book was a letter to a woman who could not love her back, written with the same confessional directness that had made her first book notable. She worked on the manuscript through the winter, writing in the early mornings before work and late at night after returning to her room. The writing exhausted her, but gave her something beyond survival to focus on. She was creating again, producing something that might matter, might be read, might restore her to visibility. By spring of 1911, she had a completed manuscript. She sent it to Herbert S. Stone first, hoping her previous success with them would count for something. Stone read it and declined. The book was too specific, too strange, unlikely to find the broad audience that her first book had reached. He suggested she try other publishers. Mary sent the manuscript to 6 other publishers over the following months. Most rejected it outright. 2 expressed mild interest, but wanted significant revisions that would have removed everything that made the book distinctive. Mary refused. Finally, a small Chicago publisher agreed to release the book with minimal changes. They offered a tiny advance and low royalty rates. The terms were unfavorable, but Mary had no leverage. She needed the book published. She signed the contract. My Friend, Annabel Lee, was released in October 1911. The publisher did minimal promotion. There was no publicity campaign, no advance copies sent to major newspapers, no attempt to capitalize on Mary's previous notoriety. The book appeared in a small number of bookstores and disappeared almost immediately. Reviews were scarce and mostly negative. Critics who remembered Mary's first book found this one disappointing. It lacked the shocking confessions and blasphemous declarations that had made the story of Mary MacLane scandalous. Instead, it was melancholic, obsessive, repetitive. One reviewer called it the diary of an unhealthy fixation, tedious to read and disturbing in its implications. Sales were minimal. The book sold perhaps a few hundred copies in its first month, then stopped selling almost entirely. Mary received her advance, but no royalties beyond it. The book had failed commercially and critically. The failure was different from the silence that had surrounded her previous years in Chicago. The silence had been passive, the world forgetting her, because she had produced nothing new. This was active rejection. She had produced something, offered it to the world, and the world had looked at it and turned away. Mary continued working at the mail order company. She addressed envelopes and thought about the fact that her second book had sold fewer copies than she addressed in a single day at work. The comparison was crushing. Her words, her emotional life, her art, all of it mattered less than the mechanical labor she performed to survive. She received a handful of letters from readers. Most were from women who had felt something similar, who thanked her for writing honestly about feelings they had been taught to suppress or deny. The letters were kind, but they came from strangers and changed nothing about her circumstances. One letter came from a man who accused her of corrupting young women, of promoting unnatural affections, of contributing to moral decay. He suggested she should be ashamed. Mary read the letter once and burned it. She had no energy for shame. She was too tired. Herbert S. Stone wrote to her in December. He was polite but clear. Given the failure of her second book, he saw no commercial viability in publishing anything else from her. He wished her well, but suggested she might consider other pursuits. The letter was a dismissal, professionally worded but final. Mary understood that her literary career, such as it had been, was over. She had published 2 books. The first had been a phenomenon that faded quickly. The second had been a failure from the start. No publisher would invest in a third book from an author whose most recent work had sold so poorly. She was 30 years old. She had achieved everything she had wanted when she was 19. Publication, recognition, escape from Butte. None of it had led anywhere. The fame had been brief. The recognition had not translated into community or connection. The escape had delivered her to poverty and isolation in a different city. She thought about returning to Butte. Her mother still lived there with Clenza. Perhaps they would allow her to return, to live in the house on West Granite Street again. But the thought was unbearable. Returning would be admission of complete failure. It would be proof that everything she had written, everything she had believed about herself, had been delusion. She stayed in Chicago. She worked, ate minimally, paid rent, existed. She stopped writing except for occasional journal entries. The journals were no longer preparations for books. They were simply records of days passing without event or meaning. Winter came. Mary turned 31 in her rented room with no celebration, no acknowledgement. The birthday was just another day, distinguished from others only by her awareness that another year had passed and nothing had changed. She had wanted to be a writer. She had been a writer briefly. Now she was a woman who addressed envelopes for money and lived alone in a city that had no use for her. The second book sat in a box under her bed. She had kept a few copies. Occasionally she would take one out and read passages, trying to remember what she had felt when writing them. The feelings were inaccessible now, distant as events from someone else's life. The years after the second book's failure blurred together into a stretch of time Mary would later struggle to account for. She worked when she could find work, moved between cheap boarding houses when she could not pay rent, disappeared from any record that might document how she spent her days. The envelope addressing position ended in 1912. The company consolidated operations and eliminated her job along with dozens of others. Mary looked for similar work and found nothing immediately. She had no references, no employment history that made her desirable to employers. The gaps in her work record raised questions she could not answer satisfactorily. She survived on what remained of her book earnings, and then on nothing at all. She fell behind on rent. The landlady at her boarding house was patient for 2 months, then less patient, then firm. Mary had to leave. She took her few possessions and moved to a settlement house that provided temporary shelter for women without means. The settlement house was crowded, chaotic, supervised by well-meaning women who treated residents as problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. Mary shared a dormitory room with 8 other women. She had no privacy, no space for writing, no dignity. She stayed there for 6 weeks, long enough to find work washing dishes at a restaurant near the Loop. The work was hard, hot, monotonous. Her hands developed burns and cuts that never fully healed. She stood for 10 hours a day in a steaming kitchen, washing dishes for people she would never see, creating nothing, contributing nothing, beyond the basic maintenance of other people's meals. The job paid enough for rent at the cheapest boarding houses. Mary moved into a room in a building that should have been condemned. The walls were thin enough to hear every conversation in adjacent rooms. The hallway smelled of urine and rotting food. Mice ran openly, but it was shelter, and it was hers, and she paid for it with her own labor. She stopped trying to write for publication. The failure of the second book had proven that her talent, whatever it had been, was exhausted or irrelevant. She wrote occasionally in journals, but the entries were sparse, factual, records of survival rather than explorations of consciousness. In 1913, she lost the dishwashing position. The restaurant hired a younger woman who worked faster and complained less. Mary looked for other work and found a position cleaning offices at night. She worked alone, scrubbing floors in empty buildings, emptying trash cans, washing windows. The solitude was preferable to the kitchen's chaos, but the work paid less. She moved again to a room even smaller than the last. She owned almost nothing by this point. Two changes of clothes, a few books, her journals. She had sold or abandoned everything else. Possessions required space and money to move. She had neither. Her health began to decline. She developed a persistent cough that worsened in winter. She ignored it because seeing a doctor cost money she did not have. The cough became bronchitis, then something worse. She missed work because she could not breathe well enough to walk to the office building. She lost the cleaning position. For several weeks in early 1914, she had no income at all. She survived on charity from settlement houses, on meals at missions that required listening to sermons before eating. She sat through religious services she did not believe in to receive food she desperately needed. The irony was not lost on her. She had written a scandalous book partly because she rejected conventional Christianity. Now she depended on Christians for survival. She found another position, this time in a laundry. The work was brutal. She stood over vats of boiling water, stirring sheets and clothing with long wooden paddles, breathing steam and chemical fumes. The heat was overwhelming. Women fainted regularly. Mary learned to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in herself and others, learned when to step outside before collapsing. The laundry work damaged her hands permanently. The combination of hot water, harsh soap, and constant friction left her skin cracked and bleeding. She wrapped her hands in rags at night, but they never healed completely. Years later, the scars would remain. She turned 33 in the laundry, working a double shift because the money was desperately needed. No one knew it was her birthday. She did not mention it. The date had no significance beyond marking another year of survival. In 1915, she lost the laundry position when the business closed. She was unemployed again, searching again, increasingly desperate. She was in her mid-30s now, no longer young, worn down by years of physical labor and poverty. Employers looked at her and saw someone tired, unreliable, used up. She took whatever work she could find. Selling newspapers on street corners, delivering parcels, scrubbing steps in residential buildings. None of these positions lasted long. She was fired from one job for being too slow, from another for missing days when she was ill, from another for reasons never explained. The boarding houses grew progressively worse. She lived in buildings without proper heating, without adequate plumbing, with residents who fought violently or screamed through the night. She learned to sleep through noise, to ignore conflicts that did not directly threaten her, to keep herself invisible. She had no friends. The other women she worked with or lived near were struggling as desperately as she was. There was no energy for friendship, no surplus attention to offer others. Everyone was focused on their own survival. Mary understood this and did not resent it. She had nothing to offer anyone else either. She thought occasionally about her first book, about the girl who had written it. That person seemed impossible now, a character from someone else's story. That girl had believed her intelligence and sensitivity made her special, deserving of recognition. This woman knew better. Intelligence meant nothing without money or connections. Sensitivity was a liability, making poverty more painful rather than less. By 1916, Mary had been poor for so long that she could barely remember living any other way. The years of fame, of modest comfort, of possibility, they felt fictional, dreamlike, unconnected to her current existence. She was 35 years old, chronically ill, working irregular jobs for insufficient pay, living in conditions that barely qualified as housing. She had published 2 books. Somewhere, in libraries and used bookstores, copies of those books still existed, but the woman who had written them might as well have died years ago. In the summer of 1917, Mary received a letter from a film producer in New York. The letter had been forwarded through her publisher, who still had a business address for her despite years of minimal contact. The producer had read the story of Mary MacLane and believed it could be adapted for cinema. The proposal was unusual. The producer did not want to create a conventional narrative film based on her book. He wanted Mary herself to star in a semi-autobiographical picture called Men Who Have Made Love to Me. The film would show Mary reflecting on various romantic encounters, real or imagined. It would be provocative, modern, exactly the kind of content that would attract audiences seeking something daring. Mary read the letter multiple times. She had not thought about her book or her brief fame in years. She had assumed both were permanently forgotten. The offer seemed impossible, potentially fraudulent. But the letterhead appeared legitimate. The producer's name, Arthur Brisbane, was known in film circles. The offer included payment, not a large sum, but more money than Mary had seen in years. Enough to live on for months, perhaps a year if managed carefully. Enough to stop working in laundries and kitchens. Enough to matter. She wrote back expressing cautious interest. Brisbane responded quickly. He wanted her to come to New York. The studio would pay for transportation and housing during filming. They would handle all logistics. Mary needed only to appear, to be herself on camera, to recreate the confessional persona that had made her book notable. Mary had nothing to lose. She was working at a cannery, standing for 12 hours daily packing vegetables into jars. Her hands were permanently damaged, her health poor, her prospects non-existent. If the film offer was legitimate, it represented the first opportunity she had been offered in half a decade. If it was fraudulent, she would discover that soon enough. She took what little money she had saved and bought a train ticket to New York. She arrived in August, thinner than she had been when she left Montana 15 years earlier, dressed in clothes that were clean but visibly worn, carrying a single bag. The studio was located in Fort Lee, New Jersey, across the river from Manhattan. Brisbane met her at the station. He was younger than she expected, enthusiastic in ways that made her immediately wary. He talked rapidly about the film's potential, about Mary's natural screen presence, about the publicity they would generate. Mary said little. She had learned caution through years of disappointment. She would wait to see what the work actually involved before deciding if she had made a mistake. The filming began within days. The studio was primitive, a converted warehouse with minimal equipment, harsh lighting, no sound recording. Silent films required only visual performance, which Brisbane assured Mary would be easy. She simply needed to look into the camera and think about the men she had loved or desired. The script, such as it was, involved Mary sitting in various poses, while title cards described romantic encounters. Some were loosely based on her actual life. Others were invented by Brisbane to create dramatic variety. Mary was supposed to react to these narratives, to convey emotion through facial expressions and gestures. She discovered quickly that she had no talent for this. Her face did not express emotion in ways that read clearly on camera. When she tried to look longing or regretful or passionate, she simply looked uncomfortable. The director repeatedly asked her to project feeling more strongly. She did not know how. Brisbane grew frustrated. He had assumed that someone who wrote so intensely about emotion would be able to perform it visually. But Mary's intensity had always been internal, expressed through language, not gesture or expression. On camera, she appeared stiff, self-conscious, unable to translate feeling into visible performance. The filming continued for 3 weeks. Mary performed as directed, sitting in staged settings while the camera recorded her attempting to embody emotions she did not feel. Between takes, she sat alone, speaking to no one. The crew treated her with polite distance. She was the subject of the film, but not part of their community. She was paid weekly, small amounts that felt substantial after years of poverty. She saved most of it, buying only necessary food, living in the cheap hotel the studio provided. She did not trust that the film would actually be completed or released. She assumed this opportunity would dissolve like others before it. In September, filming concluded. Brisbane showed Mary some of the footage. She watched herself on screen and felt profound disconnection. The woman in the film looked like her, but moved strangely, stiffly, like someone performing an impersonation. The title cards describing romantic encounters felt absurd, overlaid on images of her expressionless face. Brisbane assured her the film would be successful. It was provocative, unusual, exactly what audiences wanted. Mary did not believe him, but said nothing. She had been paid. That was what mattered. The film was released in early 1918 to a handful of theaters. Reviews were harsh. Critics called it exploitative, tedious, poorly conceived. One reviewer wrote that Mary MacLane had degraded herself for commercial purposes, transforming youthful indiscretion into middle-aged desperation. Another suggested the film proved that some writers should never leave the page. The film failed commercially. Most theaters dropped it after a few showings. The audiences who came expecting scandal found instead a static, awkward series of tableaux featuring a woman who looked tired and uncomfortable. The provocative title had promised something the film could not deliver. Mary saw the film once in a small theater in Manhattan. She watched herself on screen surrounded by perhaps a dozen other viewers. Some laughed at moments that were not intended to be funny. Others left before the film ended. Mary sat through the entire showing and left without speaking to anyone. The experience confirmed what years of poverty had already taught her. Her moment had passed. The public's brief interest in Mary MacLane had exhausted itself more than a decade earlier. Attempting to revive it through film had not restored her visibility. It had simply made her invisible in a different medium. She returned to Chicago in late 1918 with slightly more money than she had left with. The film had been a failure, but it had paid her. That was more than most opportunities had offered. She was 37 years old. She had written 2 books and starred in 1 film. All had failed or faded. She had nothing left to sell, no part of herself that anyone wanted. Mary returned to Chicago in November 1918 as the influenza pandemic was killing thousands across the city. She found a room in a tenement on the west side, far from the neighborhoods where she had lived during her early years in Chicago. The area was predominantly industrial, crowded with immigrants working in factories and stockyards. She was anonymous here in a way she had not been before. She did not look for factory work immediately. The money from the film gave her a brief reprieve. She decided to attempt writing again, not because she believed it would succeed, but because she had no other skill worth developing. She was too old and too worn for physical labor to be sustainable much longer. She began writing essays and short pieces, trying to pitch them to magazines and newspapers. She wrote about her experiences in poverty, about women's work, about the gulf between how people imagine poverty and what it actually demanded. The writing was clear, direct, unsentimental. It lacked the confessional intensity of her books, but had a different kind of honesty. She sent submissions to dozens of publications through the winter of 1918 and into 1919. Most were rejected without comment. A few were rejected with notes suggesting the content was too depressing, too harsh, not appropriate for their readership. One editor wrote that readers wanted uplift and hope, not accounts of suffering without resolution. A small socialist newspaper accepted one piece about working conditions in laundries. They paid $5. The essay appeared without fanfare and generated no response. Mary wrote more pieces in a similar vein, but the socialist paper did not accept additional submissions. They had limited space and many contributors. She tried writing about her earlier fame, attempting to market herself as someone with an interesting backstory. She pitched essays titled What Happened to Mary MacLane and 10 Years After Scandal to magazines that had once covered her. None responded. The editors who remembered her had moved on. The younger editors had no idea who she was. By spring of 1919, her film money was depleted. She found work in a bindery, folding and stitching pages into books. The irony was not lost on her. She was physically assembling books written by others while her own writing went unpublished. She worked alongside women who had never heard of Mary MacLane, who knew nothing about her books or her brief notoriety. She continued writing in the early mornings before work. The writing became increasingly desperate in tone. She wrote long essays arguing for her own relevance, explaining why her perspective mattered, insisting that she had important things to say. The pieces were unmarketable. No editor wanted essays that were primarily arguments for the author's significance. In 1920, she attempted to contact Herbert S. Stone about potentially reissuing The Story of Mary MacLane with a new introduction. Stone's company had been sold, reorganized, and he was no longer involved in publishing decisions. The new owners were not interested in reviving books from nearly 2 decades earlier. She wrote to other publishers suggesting a third book, an account of her years since the first book's publication. She framed it as a cautionary tale, a story of what happens after sudden fame. Publishers who responded at all said the concept was too depressing. One suggested she might find an audience for inspirational writing about overcoming hardship if she could frame her experiences positively. Mary could not. She turned 40 in May 1921. She marked the occasion by attempting to calculate how many words she had written in her life. The number was staggering. Journals, letters, 2 books, hundreds of essays and submissions. Almost all of it unread, unpublished, lost. She had produced an enormous quantity of language that had disappeared into silence. The bindery work ended when the business reduced staff. Mary was among the first fired, older, slower, less productive than younger workers. She found temporary positions addressing Christmas cards, stuffing envelopes, work that appeared seasonally and vanished afterward. She wrote a letter to her mother asking if she could return to Butte. Margaret's response was brief. Clenza had died 2 years earlier. Margaret was living with Mary's sister and her family. There was no room for Mary. Margaret sent $20 and suggested Mary find a women's charitable organization that might help her establish stability. The rejection was expected, but still painful. Mary had burned every bridge leading back to Montana. Her family had moved on without her. She was stranded in Chicago with no safety net, no resources beyond her own diminishing capacity to work. In late 1921, she tried one final publishing attempt. She wrote a short book, fewer than 100 pages, about her experiences with fame and obscurity. She titled it, I, Mary MacLane, A Diary of Human Days. She wrote it quickly, without the obsessive revision that had characterized her earlier work. She sent it to small presses willing to consider unknown authors. One publisher in Boston expressed interest, but asked her to pay for a portion of the printing costs. The practice was common for authors without established reputations. Mary did not have the money, she wrote back explaining her situation. The publisher withdrew their offer. She continued working temporary jobs through 1922. She moved frequently, always to cheaper rooms, always falling behind on rent, always scrambling for the next week's survival. Her health continued declining. The chronic cough had never fully resolved. She had pains in her chest that she ignored because acknowledging them would require money and time she did not have. She wrote less frequently. The journals she had kept compulsively for decades became sporadic. Entire months passed without entries. When she did write, the entries were brief notations of work found, money earned, rent paid. The introspection that had once filled hundreds of pages had contracted to simple accounting. By late 1922, she had stopped writing almost entirely. She had nothing new to say, and no one willing to listen. Her voice, which had once seemed so urgent and necessary, had become irrelevant. The world had moved on without her, and she had no energy left to demand its attention. She was 41 years old, poor, sick, isolated. She had wanted to be a writer. She had been a writer briefly. Now she was simply a woman trying to survive in a city that had never wanted her and would not notice when she disappeared. In January 1923, Mary moved into a room on South State Street, a tenement in a district known for transient residents and marginal businesses. The building was 4 stories, brick, structurally unsound. The room was on the 3rd floor, accessible by a staircase that sagged under weight. The previous tenant had died there. The landlord did not mention this until after Mary had paid the first week's rent. The room contained a narrow bed, a chair, a small table. There was no heat except what came from a radiator in the hallway that worked intermittently. In winter, the room was cold enough that water left in a cup overnight would freeze. Mary learned to sleep in her clothes wrapped in the single blanket the room provided. She found occasional work through an agency that placed women in temporary domestic positions. She cleaned houses for families who wanted help for a day or a week. The work was sporadic, unpredictable. Some weeks she worked 3 or 4 days. Other weeks, nothing. The families she worked for did not know who she was. They saw a middle-aged woman, thin, worn, grateful for employment. They gave her instructions and left her alone. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, cleaned toilets. She did the work adequately but without enthusiasm. She was paid daily, small amounts that covered rent and minimal food. Her health deteriorated steadily. The chest pains she had ignored for years became constant. She had difficulty breathing, especially climbing stairs. She coughed frequently, sometimes severely enough that she had to stop working and sit until the coughing subsided. The families she worked for noticed but said nothing. Sick workers were expendable. In the spring of 1924, she collapsed while cleaning a house in Hyde Park. The family called an ambulance. She was taken to Cook County Hospital, the public facility that treated those without money or insurance. She spent 3 days there, diagnosed with chronic bronchitis and malnutrition. The doctors said she needed rest, better nutrition, time to recover. They discharged her with recommendations she had no ability to follow. She returned to the room on South State Street weaker than before. She could not work for several weeks. She fell behind on rent. The landlord threatened eviction. She sold her few remaining possessions. Books she had carried from Montana, a brooch that had belonged to her mother, her journals from the early Chicago years. The money from these sales bought her another month. By summer she was working again but could only manage light duties. She took positions washing dishes in cheap restaurants, work that allowed her to sit occasionally. The pay was worse than cleaning houses, but it was what her body could tolerate. She spoke to almost no one. The other residents in her building were workers like herself, people exhausted by labor, focused on survival. There was no community, no conversation beyond brief exchanges in the hallway. Mary preferred the silence. She had nothing to say that anyone would want to hear. In 1925, she turned 44. She observed the day alone in her room, too tired to work, too poor to mark the occasion in any meaningful way. She thought about the fact that she had lived longer than she had expected to when she was young. She had imagined dying young, dramatically, mourned by those who had failed to appreciate her. Instead, she was middle-aged, obscure, dying slowly of poverty and neglect. She tried occasionally to write, but the effort exhausted her. Her hands, damaged by years of labor, cramped after a few minutes. Her thoughts came slowly, disconnected. The clarity and intensity that had characterized her early writing were gone, replaced by a vague awareness that she had once had something to say, but could no longer remember what it was. In early 1926, she lost consciousness while working in a restaurant kitchen. She woke in the hospital again, this time for a week. The diagnosis was more serious: heart strain, possible tuberculosis, severe malnutrition. The doctors kept her longer, trying to stabilize her condition. When they discharged her, they told her she should not be working. She returned to work 3 days later because the alternative was starvation. The work became increasingly difficult. She could barely manage a few hours before exhaustion forced her to stop. Employers stopped hiring her. She was visibly ill, unreliable, more liability than help. By mid-1926, she could not find work at all. She survived on charity. Settlement houses provided occasional meals. Churches offered bread and soup to those willing to sit through services. Mary attended, ate, left without speaking to anyone. She had once scorned these institutions. Now she depended on them. In 1927, she applied for aid from the city. The process required documentation, proof of residency, employment history, family contacts. Mary had none of these in usable form. She had lived in dozens of places, worked hundreds of temporary jobs, severed all family connections. The aid application was denied. She moved again to a smaller room in a worse building. The new landlord charged less but provided nothing: no heat, no maintenance, no concern for tenants' welfare. Mary lived there because it was the only place she could afford. She stopped leaving the room except when necessary. She was too weak to walk far, too ill to work, too exhausted to seek help that would not come. She lay in bed for days at a time, drifting between sleep and consciousness, losing track of time. Neighbors occasionally heard her coughing through the thin walls. No one checked on her. In buildings like this, people minded their own suffering. Intervention meant responsibility, and no one had surplus capacity for someone else's crisis. In early 1929, Mary realized she was dying. The knowledge came without drama or fear, simply a recognition that her body was failing in ways that could not be reversed. She was 47 years old. She had lived in Chicago for more than 20 years. She had published 2 books and starred in 1 failed film. She had worked dozens of jobs, lived in scores of rooms, survived longer than seemed possible, given her circumstances. She had no one to notify about her decline. Her mother was likely dead, her siblings estranged beyond contact. She had no friends, no community, no connections to anyone who would care whether she lived or died. She lay in the room on South State Street and waited. The waiting was all that remained. Mary MacLane died on August 6, 1929, in the room on South State Street. The landlord discovered her body 3 days later when other tenants complained about the smell. She had been dead long enough that determining the exact cause was difficult. The death certificate listed heart failure as the primary cause, with malnutrition and chronic respiratory disease as contributing factors. She was 48 years old. There was no one to notify. The landlord searched her room for family contacts and found nothing useful. He discovered a few old letters addressed to Mrs. Margaret Clens in Montana. But when he wrote to that address, the letter returned marked deceased. Mary's mother had died 2 years earlier. The landlord had no way of knowing this, and no other leads to follow. Mary's body was taken to the Cook County morgue, where it remained for 2 weeks while the city attempted to locate next of kin. The search was cursory. The city dealt with dozens of unclaimed bodies monthly. Resources for tracking down distant relatives of poor women were limited. Eventually, the landlord mentioned to a neighbor that the deceased woman had once been a writer. The neighbor recalled hearing something years ago about a scandalous book by someone named Mary MacLane. The information was passed to a clerk at the morgue who mentioned it to a reporter who occasionally covered unusual deaths. The reporter investigated and confirmed the identity. He wrote a brief article that appeared in the Chicago Tribune on August 25, 1929. The headline read, "Mary MacLane, once famous author, dies in poverty." The article was fewer than 300 words. It summarized her early success, mentioned the scandal of her first book, noted that she had fallen into obscurity and died alone in a tenement. The article generated minimal response. A few readers who remembered her book from their youth wrote letters to the paper expressing surprise that she had still been alive. One letter suggested that her death was a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking fame through scandal. Another praised her early honesty and mourned that the world had not valued her sufficiently. No family came forward to claim her body or arrange burial. The city buried her in a pauper's section of Oakwood Cemetery on September 3, 1929. The grave was unmarked except for a small metal plate with a number. No service was held. No one attended the burial except the cemetery workers who dug the grave and lowered the plain wooden coffin into the ground. Her belongings were disposed of by the landlord. He kept nothing, finding no items of value. If journals or manuscripts remained in her room, they were thrown away with her clothes and other possessions. No inventory was made. No one thought to preserve anything. The few copies of her books that remained in libraries and used bookstores continued sitting unread. The story of Mary MacLane occasionally circulated, checked out by students or curious readers who had heard references to the scandal. Most found the book dated, difficult to relate to, less shocking than its reputation suggested. My friend, Annabel Lee, was almost entirely forgotten. Libraries discarded it during space-saving purges. The few copies that survived sat in storage, never requested, gathering dust. The 1930s passed with no mention of Mary MacLane in literary histories or cultural retrospectives. The decade had its own concerns: economic collapse, political upheaval, international tensions. A forgotten author who had died in poverty was not notable among the era's many tragedies. In 1942, a graduate student at the University of Chicago researching women's confessional writing found references to Mary's first book. She tracked down a copy and wrote a brief mention of it in her dissertation. The dissertation was read by her committee and filed in the university library. It generated no further interest. The war years consumed public attention. Mary's name did not appear in print anywhere during this period. The handful of people who had known her personally were dead or had forgotten her. The readers who had once found her scandalous had moved on to other concerns or died themselves. In 1949, exactly 20 years after her death, a small literary magazine published an essay about forgotten women writers of the early 20th century. Mary MacLane was mentioned in a single paragraph. The author of the essay noted that she had briefly shocked Edwardian sensibilities with her frank confessions, then vanished into the obscurity from which she had briefly emerged. The essay generated one letter to the editor from a woman who had read Mary's book as a teenager in 1902. She wrote that the book had made her feel less alone, had shown her that other women felt the intensity and isolation she felt. She also noted that she had assumed Mary MacLane had gone on to literary success and was disturbed to learn she had died in poverty. The editor did not publish the letter. It arrived too late for the next issue, and by the time another issue was being prepared, the topic had moved on. Mary's grave remained unmarked and unvisited. Oakwood Cemetery kept minimal records of pauper burials. Over time, the exact location of her grave became uncertain. The metal plate corroded and fell off, or was removed during groundskeeping. By the late 1940s, there was no reliable way to locate where Mary MacLane had been buried. Her books continued their slow disappearance. Libraries that still held copies eventually discarded them to make room for newer acquisitions. Used bookstores sold them for pennies to collectors of curiosities, or threw them away when shelf space was needed. By 1949, almost nothing remained of Mary MacLane's presence in the world. Her books were nearly impossible to find. Her grave was unmarked and lost. No photographs of her circulated. No one living had known her personally. The brief fame that had once seemed so important, that she had wanted so desperately, had evaporated completely. She had written 2 books confessing her interior life, believing that honesty would create lasting connection. Instead, the honesty had created brief scandal, followed by long forgetting. She had sought recognition and achieved it momentarily, then watched it dissolve across decades of poverty and isolation. 20 years after her death, Mary MacLane existed only as an occasional footnote in obscure academic papers. A name mentioned briefly in histories of scandal, a cautionary reference in discussions of fame's failures. The person herself, her thoughts, her suffering, her refusal to perform acceptable femininity, her desperate need to be seen, had vanished. In 1952, a feminist scholar named Elizabeth Pruitt found a copy of The Story of Mary MacLane in a used bookstore in Boston. She bought it for 25 cents, intrigued by the title and the Victorian binding. She read it in one sitting and immediately recognized its significance. Here was a woman writing frankly about desire, about contempt for social conventions, about refusing traditional femininity, decades before such honesty became more common. Pruitt wrote an article for a small academic journal arguing that Mary MacLane deserved reconsideration as an early feminist voice. The article appeared in 1954. It was read by perhaps 200 people, most of them scholars specializing in women's literature. A handful found the argument compelling. Most found Mary's writing too solipsistic, too limited, too focused on individual suffering rather than structural critique. The article generated brief interest. 2 other scholars wrote responses, one agreeing with Pruitt's assessment, the other arguing that Mary's self-absorption made her a poor candidate for feminist recovery. The debate appeared in subsequent issues of the journal, then ended. Mary MacLane was mentioned occasionally in footnotes for the next decade, but no sustained scholarly attention followed. In 1963, a small press in Montana reprinted The Story of Mary MacLane, with an introduction by a local historian. The edition was marketed as a regional curiosity, a glimpse into Montana's frontier era. The press printed 500 copies. Most were sold to libraries and Montana history enthusiasts. The book was reviewed in 2 regional newspapers. Both reviews emphasized the book's shock value in its original context, treating it as a historical artifact rather than living literature. The 1963 edition sold slowly. By 1968, the press still had copies in storage. They were eventually remaindered, sold to discount book distributors for pennies. Some ended up in thrift stores, others were pulped. The women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s created renewed interest in forgotten women writers. Feminist scholars and activists sought to recover women's voices that had been erased or dismissed. Mary MacLane appeared briefly in this recovery effort. In 1971, a feminist publishing collective in New York reprinted The Story of Mary MacLane with a new introduction, framing Mary as a proto-feminist rebel who had challenged patriarchal constraints. The edition was distributed through women's bookstores and alternative channels. It sold moderately well, finding readers among young women interested in historical examples of female resistance. But the interest did not sustain. Mary's book was too strange, too focused on individual psychology rather than collective politics. Her contempt for other women, her obsession with Napoleon, her declarations of love for the devil, these elements made her difficult to incorporate into feminist narratives. She was too idiosyncratic, too isolated, too hostile to community. By the mid-1970s, the feminist edition was out of print. Mary MacLane returned to obscurity, mentioned occasionally in academic papers, but not widely read. In 1983, a documentary filmmaker discovered Mary's story while researching early women writers in Montana. She began work on a film about Mary's life, conducted interviews with historians, tracked down what little information remained. The project stalled when funding fell through. The filmmaker moved on to other work. The incomplete footage was stored and eventually lost. The 1990s brought another brief moment of attention. A scholar writing about early LGBT literature included a chapter on Mary MacLane, focusing on her descriptions of desire for women, particularly her obsession with Fanny Corbin and the romance detailed in My Friend Annabel Lee. The book was published by a university press in 1994. This recovery attempt was more successful than previous ones. Mary's name began appearing in LGBT literary histories. Her books were cited as early examples of same-sex desire in American literature. Some scholars argued she deserved recognition as a queer pioneer, but again the interest was limited to academic circles. General readers did not discover Mary. Her books were not reprinted for mass audiences. She remained a footnote, a name mentioned in specialized histories, not a figure of broader cultural significance. In 2002, exactly 100 years after the publication of her first book, a small Montana literary festival held a panel discussion about Mary MacLane. 3 scholars presented papers. About 40 people attended. The local newspaper covered the event with a brief article. The discussion was thoughtful, respectful, but generated no broader awareness. The internet age brought scattered attention. Bloggers interested in forgotten writers occasionally discovered Mary and wrote posts about her. These posts circulated briefly, were shared among small communities of literary enthusiasts, then disappeared into the endless scroll of content. In 2013, a gender studies scholar published an article arguing that Mary MacLane's erasure was itself significant, evidence of how women's expressions of desire and anger were systematically forgotten. The argument was compelling but reached only academic audiences. Mary remained unknown outside specialized fields. A 2017 attempt to locate her grave failed. Cemetery records were incomplete. The pauper section where she was buried had been repurposed decades earlier. Her exact burial location was lost. There was nowhere to leave flowers, no site for remembrance. By 2020, some of Mary's work was available digitally, scanned and uploaded to online archives. Anyone with internet access could read the story of Mary MacLane for free, but almost no one did. The book existed in digital form, but was not discovered, not read, not discussed. The pattern repeated: brief rediscovery, limited interest, renewed forgetting. Every decade or two, someone would encounter Mary's work, become fascinated, attempt to bring her to wider attention. The attempts never succeeded in creating sustained interest. Mary MacLane remained what she had become by the time of her death, a figure of marginal interest to specialists, unknown to general readers, forgotten by culture at large. Her books existed in archives and libraries, available but unread. Her name appeared in footnotes and specialized indices, referenced but not remembered. The fame she had wanted so desperately, that had arrived so dramatically in 1902, had proven unsustainable. The recognition lasted months. The forgetting lasted generations and showed no signs of ending. She had written to be seen, to prove her existence mattered, to create connection across isolation. Instead, her words sat unread in archives. Her grave was lost. Her name was forgotten. The world had looked at Mary MacLane briefly, decided she was not worth sustained attention, and moved on. The erasure was not malicious. It was simply indifference. The world's refusal to care about a woman who had demanded to be cared about, who had offered her interior life as worthy of attention, who had been briefly interesting and then was not. Mary MacLane wanted to be remembered. She wrote 2 books confessing everything she thought and felt, believing honesty would create permanence. She exposed her desires, her contempt, her loneliness with a frankness that scandalized readers in 1902 and still reads as raw today, when confessional writing has become commonplace. The scandal lasted months. The forgetting has lasted a century. Her grave is lost somewhere in Oakwood Cemetery, unmarked and unlocatable. Her books exist in archives but are rarely read. Her name appears occasionally in academic footnotes, mentioned briefly, then abandoned. The fame she sacrificed everything to achieve dissolved completely, leaving almost no trace. She lived 48 years. 27 of those years came after her brief notoriety ended. 27 years of poverty, isolation, failed attempts to reclaim attention, slow physical decline. She worked in laundries and kitchens. She lived in tenements. She died alone in a rented room and was buried in a pauper's grave. The question that remains is not whether she deserved better. The question is what wealth of any kind, fame, recognition, visibility, actually provides when it arrives and then departs. Mary believed being seen would solve her isolation. She was seen briefly by hundreds of thousands of readers. The isolation deepened anyway. She believed recognition would prove her worth. She was recognized, then forgotten. She believed her honesty would create lasting connection. The honesty created scandal, then silence. Perhaps she was wrong about what she needed. Perhaps the world was wrong about what she offered. Perhaps both things are true simultaneously. Her writing still exists, available to anyone curious enough to seek it out. Almost no one does. The voice that demanded attention with such intensity now speaks to almost no one, preserved but unheard, present but ignored. Mary MacLane spent her life trying to matter. Whether she succeeded depends on what mattering means. Brief visibility or lasting presence, temporary scandal or sustained recognition, being remembered or simply having lived. The world gave her the first of each pair. She wanted the second. The gap between what she received and what she needed was where she spent 27 years, then died. The books remain. The grave is lost. The question stays open.